Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. Welcome to my channel, because I have two of them now. I have tried to bifurcate my streams in response to my childhood experience of the Ghostbusters movie. Today's guest, because this is an interview, is Jonathan Church, who is an author and an economist. He has been researching very thoroughly and writing some very well-argued articles about the fragility of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility concept. We spoke last fall about this fragility, and we get back into it again and get a little bit more thorough into what makes Robin DiAngelo's argument and the critical race argument and the Whiteness Studies arguments really suspect, not just on a moral level, we do get into the moral level, but on an intellectual level. So if you're wondering why this kind of doesn't feel like a good idea, you probably have good reason to feel that way. And if you don't want to watch two guys arguing about this point, well, White Fragility already has you covered because you don't have to listen to us, because everything we speak is in defense or defensiveness of our own fragility. Anyways, that's a bullshit argument, and we'll get into why that is a bullshit argument, but I'm sure I'm going to get those comments down in that comment field. Here you go. Here's Jonathan Church. Have you done any more interviews since ours back in, I guess it was September? It might have been, I think it was September, maybe October.
I actually just had a radio interview yesterday, although that was on a different topic. Somewhat related, dealing a little bit with social justice stuff, but okay. mainly in relation to Stoicism, which I've written about a few times.
Okay. So, what's the radio program?
I don't know the name of the or if there's like a brand, but the woman's name was Leslie Doris, and she conducts this, I don't know if it's weekly, I assume it's weekly, but it's a program that deals with things like having to do with relationships and that sort of thing. Okay.
And Stoicism fits into putting up with a significant other.
I guess so. We by the way, have we started the interview, or are we just
we're just gonna cut in when it gets interesting.
Oh, okay. So we're interviewing then.
Yeah, we're just running.
Okay. So, I wrote an article in January for Quillette, and just having to do with Stoicism and brain cancer, because I had a brain tumor I was diagnosed with last year, and had surgery, and just writing about how. I was pretty stoic about it. When I first got the news, I said to the doctor, congratulations, because there, it'd been a few months run up to that, trying to figure out why I had gone into the emergency with sort of seizure-like spasms. This would have been December 2017. Anyway, whole bunch of tests over about 2 or 3 months, and then somebody, this doctor recommended MRI, and they figured it out. And I don't know, I just have a stoic approach to a lot of things. So it's kind of a philosophical perspective I've cultivated over some time. And so I wrote about it in January when the APA guidelines came out, criticizing quote unquote traditional masculinity. Yeah. One of those aspects being so-called Stoicism. And so I just sort of wrote about how, I guess the title was how my quote unquote toxic Stoicism helped me cope with brain cancer. So and I remember going in the operating room, one of my sisters saying you look like they just gave you a Valium, so I was pretty I don't know, stoic, calm, that sort of thing. And so anyway, I wrote that, and then I wrote another one for the Good Men Project, which I sort of carried on the same perspective, but criticizing the Gillette commercial, and basically making the point that it was conflating being a decent human being with being a good man. And so again, sort of tackling that whole, the whole issue around norms of masculinity, and that's the one that she picked up on, and so she invited me to come onto the show and talk about it.
Is Stoicism in its kind of its low resolution aspect is thought of as some sort of removal or hardness. And I guess that was what the completely misguided APA guidelines were pointing to when they used that word. But those guidelines themselves just use language with no respect whatsoever for a number of different terms. But
yeah, sort of like being an emotional. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it has to do with like being a hard-shelled, not feeling anything or suppressing your emotions. There's a removal aspect to it.
The basic distinction I draw is between emotional restraint and emotional repression. The latter being the thing that you want to avoid, the former being something that you can cultivate. In fact, Stoicism, as I understand it, is part of the underlying basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's actually... there's more to it too, and I'm not a psychologist, but from what I've read and heard, CBT draws upon Stoic philosophy. And so, the APA guidelines, I think, are addressing sort of a layman's understanding of sort of what they call powering through, like a soldier getting through war and that sort of thing. But my whole problem was that it reeks of social justice ideology. Which is, of course, not to say that, I always want to qualify, because when you say something like that, you end up being depicted in one way or another. I mean, social justice has its virtues. In fact, there was a very good article in Areo a couple of days ago, a defense of social justice. And I just want to, sort of put in that qualifier because, I'm pretty critical of the social justice movement, but it doesn't mean, but I'm not critical of quote unquote social justice.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, and the adherents of social justice don't do us any favors with this, but it seems like it's very easy to use it as a euphemism for something negative, social justice, in the same exact way that we use Stoic as a euphemistic principle, when there's like this underlying philosophy or I guess worldview that is underpinning it, that is very carefully thought through by the people who forged it and put it together. But there's nothing more, I don't think there's anything more abusive to social justice than the social justice, the people who claim that mantle and then run with it. So
in many ways that
there
is
could
sort
be
of
a
how
lot
it
of
wax
work
out.
Yeah. There could be a lot of work done to suss that out, to kind of sequester the abusers of that term in order to take what's good out of that stuff. And that brings me to, I guess, the nominal question about this current interview and our first interview, which was about Robin DiAngelo and white fragility. And since then, you've written at least 2 articles about it, but I see in the latest article you linked to 4 other ones. So you've written about this quite a bit.
Yeah, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, sort of 5, 6, 7 articles.
Yeah.
If I'm not missing one.
So,
yeah,
okay.
One was a very long one. They're all, one was, I think, a 35-minute read. But that was more on both white fragility and whiteness studies in general, white fragility theory as a derivative of whiteness studies, and basically arguing that it succumbs to the so-called reification fallacy. But yes, and we can get into that. But yes, I've been pouring through what I guess people call white fragility theory.
For me and perhaps some of my viewers, what is the reification fallacy?
So the idea of reification is to treat an abstract concept as having a concrete or material existence. For example, if you kind of Google this and you come up with some explanations, you could say something like, and I remember this because it's from Mad Men, which is one of my favorite shows. But in season 1, Don Draper said at one point, the universe is indifferent. And the universe, I guess you could think of as somewhat of an abstract concept, although I guess, I don't know, you could think of it as the stars and the galaxies. But the universe being some kind of cosmos, some kind of, if you're thinking about it in some metaphysical sense or whatever, it's an abstraction. It doesn't actually take on this quality of being indifferent. It's not a person. So it's an abstraction taking on. And but with respect to whiteness studies, white fragility theory, the best way I think about it is because in some sense it draws a bit on the Marxist tradition, and by that I mean just the idea of superstructure and exploitation and that sort of thing, and power structures. But in sometime in the 1920s, George Lukács, he wrote the History of Class Consciousness, and he describes reification as essentially a quote-unquote phantom objectivity, where ideology, the commodity structure, commodity relations, in I guess you could say commodify or materialize these sort of invisible relations between capitalists and workers. And so the commodity structure which underlies capitalist economy is in some sense the material embodiment of exploitative relations between capitalists and workers. And he works this out. But he I think the phrase phantom objectivity kind of conveys the point. But another way of thinking of it is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And some other fanciful terms. But
so
hopefully,
with regards to the white fragility construct, how is that a phantom objectivity?
Well, that requires a little bit of fleshing out the some of the basic views of whiteness studies in general. And
you say views, so you don't mean they're axioms or precepts?
No, they are. They actually are. You can think of them as axioms. Well, precepts. Yeah, you have. I guess you kind of have to be careful. I mean, they function as axioms. Because, for instance, so one of the authors who's very instrumental in this, pioneering scholars, is a woman named Ruth Frankenberg. And she wrote a book right here called The Social Construction of White Woman, Whiteness, Race Matters, and so on. So proof that I've read the book.
Wait, I need to see at least, you need to show the camera at least one underlined sentence, or else you could have just bought that book off Amazon. Actually, that was just a joke.
Well, fair enough, but I actually quoted in the article, the essay that I wrote.
Okay.
But at any rate, let me just bring up an actual quote. Unfortunately, I don't have a photographic memory. So DiAngelo likes to quote her quite often. And what she describes, so Frankenberg defines whiteness as, quote, a location of structural advantage, of race privilege. Second, it's a standpoint, a place from which white people look at ourselves, at others, and at society. Third, whiteness, it refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unearned. And so then DiAngelo goes on and says it's therefore conceptualized as a constellation of processes and processes rather than as a discrete entity, that is, skin color. It's dynamic, relational, operating at all times and on myriad levels, so on and so forth. And then she goes on to talk about white fragility. But the idea here is that there's this ideology or discourse. You can distinguish between ideology and discourse, but for our purposes, you can treat them as essentially the same. And that whiteness is a kind of centripetal ideology, where it draws everything into white norms, social constructs, and so on. That, for instance, Toni Morrison saying that all of American literature positions the reader as white. There was a article in the Paris Review recently by
I saw that.
Yeah. So white people need to save themselves from whiteness.
Yeah.
There was another piece that came out by a woman named Sophia Lung, how whiteness is embodied in the books in the library. Now, I don't know how strictly or rigid I want to be about this, but the idea is that whiteness is embodied in I mean, and they are quite clear about saying that whiteness is not white people themselves. As you just heard, it's not skin color. But to be white in our society is to unavoidably partake in social norms, relationships, habits, customs that reinforce a culture of white supremacy. And of course, by that they mean sort of relations between groups. You know, the relation between, say, the dominant group, white people, and the not dominant group, whether it's people of color, LGBT, so on, right? Cis versus LGBT, white people of color, man, woman. But there are these relationships between groups, between people, and that they are structured in very rigid ways. Well, not rigid, because they'll say that this is very dynamic, and that it's constantly evolving. But they're rigid in the sense that they constantly reinforce dominance. And so you have this kind of abstract notion of whiteness, which more or less refers to beliefs, values, habits, norms, all these things that we do in life. And they reinforce white supremacy because they are part of whiteness. Now, it's important to emphasize that what they're not saying is that, you know, we live in 19th century America. It's not, you know, it's not that, you know, the laws protect, you know, They don't legalize discrimination. We've made massive shifts, you know, explicit, mean, racist attitudes. That's not what they're talking about. They're just saying that as long as we are white and we are not sort of exposing or admitting our fragility and all that, that we are reinforcing cultural norms that that keep a system of dominance in place.
Okay.
And so just to recapitulate, whiteness is the abstraction. And the sort of materialization of whiteness is us participating in society, either by taking books off the library that position the reader as white, or just, you know, going to work and reading a resume and seeing a black name and thinking that, or inherently assuming that that person is less qualified, you know, sort of things like that.
Yeah. So one thing that
is known by philosophers as the reification fallacy. It's metaphorically, it's very colorful, but it does not hold up as a logical proposition.
Okay, so what makes it not hold up as a logical proposition then? What is the fundamental weakness of that jump of logic? Because it's very captivating.
Well, I mean, essentially, if you take, for example, the idea that you know, as I was saying, Toni Morrison saying that all American literature positions you as white. Well, take her novel, Song of Solomon, which is a very good novel, and Toni Morrison is an excellent novelist. And it's about a guy named Macon Dead Jr., and he's exploring throughout the story these sort of mysteries of family conflicts between his mother or his father and his father's sister, and various other sorts of conflicting relationships. And so the story to me is very much driven by that plot line. Now, it certainly, and by the way, you can hear me just fine, right?
Yeah, we're all good.
Okay. Now, it certainly does take place in Jim Crow America and function and takes place in interplay with Jim Crow America. But to read this as essentially a foil against which you can understand, in other words, to read this simply as a racial narrative is to, in some sense, not read the story in its full complexity, in its full reality, in its full sort of material or, you know, it's I don't know, fullness or whatever.
It's possibility of meaning more than just that one interpretation.
That's one way that I think about it. Also, you know, the notion that whiteness is on the shelves in the library. So whiteness is conceived as, you know, attitudes, perceptions, a frame of reference. But when you pick up a book in the library, say, Shakespeare's plays. What the hell is white about that? Just because he's white? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sure, Shakespeare is a white author,
Yeah.
but picking that up off the shelf and reading Shakespeare, in some sense, reinforces something called whiteness.
Yeah.
That really doesn't hold up as a matter of
Well,
logic.
so they have this term called whiteness, or this concept of whiteness, that they are trying to retroactively fit to every cultural product that pours out of Europe, or everything that resonates in harmony with everything that pours out of Europe. It seems like a very convenient way of just classifying everything as something that you don't have to take seriously, or you can just suspect. It goes back to Ricoeur's, what does he call it? The hermeneutics of suspicion. So you're automatically free to be suspicious of this stuff and not really engage with it in the fullness of what it could teach you, what it could expand within you, but rather it is something that's purely trying to exert a dominant hierarchy.
Yeah, I I want to be very careful about how I convey this, because I don't want to trivialize what it is that they're trying to position. I think I think it's how do I say this? DiAngelo's one of her starting point is, I am white. I have a white racial frame. I look at things as a white person, and that makes me essentially racist. I'm complicit in a sort of racist society simply by virtue of being white, right?
Yeah.
And the reason the reasoning behind that, if you can call it reasoning, is that whiteness is conceived as relationships. It's conceived as social norms, habits. And so I'm trying to think of the best way to convey this point. And I feel like I kind of got ahead of my thoughts here.
It just, one way that I am confused about it is that it seems like they are just replacing the word domination or norm or any sort of behavior that implements order as whiteness. You could just replace whiteness with these basic terms, and whiteness kind of just dissolves because, right?
I'm
like
not
with the whole term,
disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. And I think that the reason I was sort of pausing there is that I probably was trying to overthink the matter a little bit. I mean, I think it's really quite simple. An abstraction is not a reality or a material reality. That material existence is actually much more complicated. And when you start to think about things in terms of whiteness, it sort of simplifies your understanding of reality, and therefore leads to a lot of misconceptions that sort of leads you to sort of, I don't know, things like confirmation bias. It leads you to sort of frame the world in a way that might not reflect its full complexity.
Okay. So my original question was, since you've spent so much time studying this, what are the good things to salvage out of this? Or how has this made reality fuller for you or more filled with possibility, even if it's uncomfortable possibility? Have you learned anything? Or is there anything that we can learn?
From white fragility theory?
From white studies, white fragility theory? In
what sense?
Well,
I mean, there's a lot that I could say that today to that. I mean, but I mean, are you saying, is there something positive that I've learned? Have I learned that it's ultimately all bunk? Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Well,
I mean, I could go in a lot of different directions with this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, my basic strategy, just to hold my cards, is to say that I know that it's a bad idea, and I've seen the results of this theory. taken to their extreme at the Evergreen State College. Like they enshrined white fragility. When George Bridges landed, he implemented a system of governance that was based on this theory of white fragility. I know it has a bad outcome. I want to stop that bad outcome from getting to its full potential. So I think one of the ways to disarm it is to agree with it in order to disagree with it. So what are the strengths of it and where does it go wrong, right? Why is it so attractive to people?
Okay, I see. So the way that I would summarize the worldview or the theory of white fragility is to say that, in a sense, by having this conversation, we are a manifestation of white fragility.
Yeah, we're going to get comments. We will get comments.
Yeah. And so, in a sense, you could think of white fragility as essentially having this conversation. Now, the way I think about having this conversation is taking a critical look at white fragility, its assumptions, its claims, its implications, essentially seeing whether they hold up under scrutiny. Now, the white fragility crowd, DiAngelo and whatever, they'll just sort of scoff at this because for them, they've got it all figured out. And so any kind of resistance is essentially, any kind of resistance that they encounter is essentially dismissed as being defensive and fragile. And in a sense, you can understand this because she's done a lot of work over the years doing diversity training seminars, classrooms. She's written a lot of papers. She's sort of, I guess you could say, schooled, some might say indoctrinated in all of this. And so she really believes in this. And I do think that she's quite sincere about what she's saying and in her belief in all this. And so she gets, at first she was probably quite troubled, quite disturbed to encounter such hostility or resistance or whatever. She would probably say it's hostility. The problem is that ultimately I think that she just doesn't make a good argument. It doesn't hold up. It's a very weak theory for a lot of different reasons. And I think the first indication that you get of this is that she doesn't argue; she asserts. She hasn't really
seen one. I've not seen one debate with her. She never enters into a discussion about this with anybody who doubts it.
Yeah. So she doesn't frame this in terms of a hypothesis or any of her claims as a sort of hypothesis that can be tested. There's no sense of falsification. There's no sense that that you can argue. The idea that anytime that you don't sort of go along and admit your fragility and then try to tease out what that fragility is, then you're simply being defensive. You're not engaging in debate. You're not engaging in discussion. You're being and there's a very Orwellian aspect to that. There's a very Kafkaesque sort of aspect to that. Now, take, for instance, this thing that came out yesterday that I saw people on Twitter talking about, and I'm trying to find a quote of this. So she was talking about to sort of exhibit defensiveness, to sort of not sort of acknowledge your racism as a white person and that sort of thing. And again, this all presupposes an understanding of racism. Okay, so that's something that we should address. I mean, she has a very specific understanding of what racism is. Basically, systemic disparities and that sort of thing. But to be defensive about this is when somebody comes up and tells you about what white fragility is about and what racism is about, and you sort of object, this is supposedly putting on a burden on, her, people of color, whatever. It's what she calls weaponized tears or weaponized defensiveness.
Yeah.
Ultimately, white racial bullying. Now, the problem with that is The problem with that is, you see, what I think this reflects ultimately is the influence of pro-structuralism on her. That this is what you think of as sort of rhetorical bullying. It's not really making. And I wanted to say an objective statement, but the problem, I hesitate to say that because, and this is something that we should also address, she has all sorts of problems with the notion of objectivity, which itself is fallacious, by the way. She basically confuses objectivity with neutrality. But anyway, she's not interested in the language of agree or disagree. In fact, I know I've seen her in an interview. I think in one of Mike Nana's videos, I heard her say that, I don't really like the agree disagree language, and I might be mistaken that, but I believe anyway, she's not interested in that language, if you will. It's really all about reframing. It's about reframing. You see this with the Jackie Robinson narrative that she brings up, which itself is very factually problematic. But the issue is to use language in a way that sort of reflames our way of thinking about this. So if we object, we are engaging in white racial bullying. We are not engaging in scrutiny or critique. We are engaging in white racial bullying. And of course, that becomes very, very problematic because what you end up having is what I call the fragility trap, which is, as I wrote at one point, if you disagree, you're being defensive. If you read all of her work, give it due consideration, and disagree, you're being defensive.
Yeah.
If you say, okay, let's argue on the merits, same answer. So you see there's no way out. It's complete. It's either you submit to indoctrination, okay? And then, of course, that has a sort of twin sister or brother or whatever in the form of what you might call the fragility cult, which is basically all of the people who buy into this. And that is that if you defend the idea, then you're manifesting your fragility. So, the trap, the cult, whatever you want to call it. But the issue is that any sort of in good faith, I mean, look, I'm sure that there's, she writes, the first chapter, maybe the second chapter, I think it's pages 10, 11, 12 on her book. In fact, this is one of the articles I wrote about that, and she talks about how, when she talks about racism, that the reactions of white people are so predictable that she feels like we're all reading from the same cultural, the same script, and in some sense she says we are. Yeah. And then I wrote an article about this in Areo, in which this whole section, which by the way has one, anyway, never mind that. In this whole section, she's confusing correlation with causation. So her argument is, okay, white people will say, I'm an individual and this is my experience, and I don't think you take that into account. And they do that when she says, well, you're not an individual, you're part of a group, you have a white racial frame, that being white has meaning, again, getting back to whiteness, if you will. And this is where we can sort of get back into the reification fallacy, by the way. But the issue is you're white, you have a white racial frame, and that has meaning. And invariably she encounters the reaction, well, but you don't understand. I have this experience and that experience, and my experiences are unique. And she attributes this reaction to what she calls the ideology of individualism. Yeah. And she calls that an ideology. So she's basically drawing a connection between her challenge to individualism, or I guess her saying that group matters, and the reaction of white people that, well, you're not taking into account the full complexity of this and that. And this comes up in papers that she's written too.
Have you seen any evidence of her doing the same thing when a black person refutes her claims of group identity over individuality?
Well, I can bring that up in a second. But the point that to finish this point, she says that the reason she observes this constant connection, is that we are socialized to believe in ourselves as individuals, and that socialization is the mechanism by which this connection works. But there's this old, very famous idea called Hume's fork, referring to David Hume. And his basic argument, the inquiry for human understanding, if I said that right, is that all we can ever really observe is a constant conjunction of events, and that if you really pour into this, you realize that we can never really infer something about the causality of this, that the actual mechanism depends on a certain sort of circular reason that falls apart. I don't know how much we want to get into this. It kind of gets into technical philosophy, but the point is that she presumes in her typical aura of omniscience that she understands why you react the way that you do, and it has to do with you being socialized in certain ways. And we can get into that too, which is I don't think that she understands socialization as well as she claims to do. Okay. So anyway, the point here ultimately is that I wrote this article saying that that Hume's fork reveals that she mistakes correlation for causation. And of course, that exposes a whole other problem with her work having to do with her understanding of the scientific method and so on. But to get to your point about whether she's ever talked about a black, there's a paper in which she talks about a scenario in which they're talking about basic diversity training. And there's a white trainer and a black trainer. And I guess the white trainer, if I remember this correctly, went up and gave her spiel. And then the black trainer comes up and gives her spiel, and all the people in the audience are advised to stay quiet while they give the spiel. And then after this is done, a white woman, I think, in the audience raises her, says, "Well, I think that you're not taking into account the full complexity of the situation," and so on. And the white trainer, I don't know if it's DiAngelo or somebody else, tries to intervene and say she's being quote unquote problematic, which of course is problematic because, the whole idea is that you want to have healthy exchange. But at any rate, but she says you're being problematic. And at that point, I think it's a black man comes to the defense of the white woman and says, let her have her say or whatever. So he comes to the, and then at that point, I think it's a black woman who then accuses the black man of internalized oppression or whatever. And basically the whole thing falls apart. And so, I guess you could say that that's illustrative of how, if you take white fragility theory and all the things that it's trying to convey seriously, you can ultimately invalidate, ironically enough, the black man's view, who's coming to the event to defense of a white woman who's simply trying to say, I don't think this is taking into account the full complexity of the situation. Anyway, I can send the paper to you. I read that. I forget which paper it was at the moment, but I remember that particular. So anyway, sorry, I've gone on long enough.
No, absolutely. This is wonderful. So to reorient ourselves, I really do think that the work that you're doing, and I'm going to link to all 74 of your articles on this that you've done so far.
No, seven articles.
Yeah, okay, whatever.
Oh, okay, I see.
There'll be 10 by the time I publish this.
No, the reason I confuse is because I've published something like 75 or so essays.
Okay. But the thing is that I really do think that this is a very dangerous way of thinking. It's very fragile, inherently very fragile, and that's what we talked about the first time. But the thing is that it takes on the aura of strength when a crowd of people go along with it. So somebody the other day, somebody who's working on a Netflix series about 5 kids in some eastern U.S. city that got mistreated by the criminal justice system, she retweeted some quote by Robin DiAngelo that was basically this fragility trap, where that if anybody questions what this is, that very questioning is evidence that we are right. And I went through the comments, and there was just one person after another person after another person who says, I have more to learn. I have more to learn. I have more to learn. And so it at one point, it pisses off the people who don't want to have anything to do with it, but it attracts people who have a certain psychology who want to be followers. It attracts specifically sheep and wolves in sheep clothing. That's exactly what it does. It's a horrible ideology with regards to who adheres to it. And with our talk last time and with my first Rob and DiAngelo video, the only criticism I received from those is that I am white. Of course, I would disagree with this. There's no actual substance to the actual argument. So what we need to do, I think what's really important to do is to keep on exposing it as the weakness it is, and then expose people to something better, or a disarming way of dismantling this.
Let me go through real quickly so that I don't do this before we run out of time. But I'll run through, because look, I think have made clear what I think all critics of white fragility theory understand, which is that there's this trap and this cultish element to it. But I don't think that's what's going to ultimately make the case, because it just goes in circles. You're fragile. Well, you're not engaging. You're fragile, and so on. So, but I think that it's pretty clear to those, who aren't sort of indoctrinated in this. But, I try to make, I've read all of her work. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've made a good faith, and I think that there are interesting questions that she raises. I think that in page 54 of her book, when she talks about the burden of race, I think is a very good point. And we can get into that. But let me just go through the basic critiques of white fragility theory right now. First, So, listening, I guess the first, I fear that presenting this sequentially in the way that I plan to do, just because it's how I have it written, I might otherwise want to reorganize this. But one is shut up and listen. Right? That's basically one precept of white fragility theory. Now, the problem with that is listening is fine, and I think I agree that we all need to be able to listen to each other and so on. But listening is at best a necessary condition for understanding. It is not at all sufficient. And the reason that I say that is, you can listen I could sit on a lecture on quantum mechanics and not understand anything. And similarly here, where it gets very complicated by human emotions and different assumptions and conceptions and so on. So I think that the first real critical mistake that she makes is that she treats, or white fragility theory in general treats, listening as necessary and sufficient, and it's only necessary. Okay. So that's one. That by the way has problems with respect to like due process and all that too. But that brings us into the intent versus effect idea, is that for DiAngelo, you just got to do away with intent. I think in the thing that went around yesterday, she was saying, we can't prove it. People are never going to admit their intent, whatever. And that really what matters is impact. And, I don't have a problem with saying that impact matters, but I also think that intent also matters. And this is sort of part of the back and forth, the interplay between, say, I guess generally speaking, white and people of color, or men and women, or cis and trans, whatever. I don't even like framing it, just like she doesn't like to talk about agree, disagree. I don't like to think about things in terms of groups, because contrary to her view, I do believe in individualism, if only because by individualism, I mean that nobody can do my thinking for me. So that's what I mean by that. And by that, that's a quote from an interview I was recently listening to on John Locke. But anyway, so she's right that we need to listen. And she's right that we need to consider impact and effect and that sort of thing. But she's not right that listening is both necessary and sufficient. And she's not right that we need to do away with intent. And I'll give you an example, which is going to take me to the next part, which has to do with the whole understanding of racism and implicit bias. So there's a paper that was seminal in the development of the concept of microaggression. 2007, Daryl Wing Su et al., his other authors as well. This paper arises, I believe, if I remember correctly, from an anecdote that he conveyed in the paper about being on a plane with a colleague, and he was sitting down, and it was one of these sort of shuttle planes from like New York to Boston or whatever, so very small. And so they sit down in, I guess, the second or third row, whatever. Immediately after, a couple of white men came in and sat in the row in front of them. But then, because the plane needed to be balanced, the flight attendant came and asked them, Daryl Wing Su and his colleague, if they could go sit in the back to sort of even out the weight of the plane. And he didn't take to that very well. He sort of took that as a sort of indication of sort of, what he ultimately called a microaggression, a racial insensitivity. And of course, the flight attendant was offended by the implication that she was being discriminatory. Now, I'm not going to offer you any definitive conclusions on what happened there, because that's just a mess right there. Who knows, right? Now, but the important point is that the flight attendant may or may not be right when she says, I didn't have any intent on being discriminatory. In fact, the white men, if I remember correctly, sat in front of them, so it may have simply occurred to her naturally to ask the people in back of them to just go a little farther back. But who knows? It's all speculation. That's ultimately the point, is that this is very speculative. But the second thing to point out, which is a little bit more systematic in the nature of its inquiry, is to say, would you observe the same result if you did the same experiment over and over and over? In other words, would people who also were in that position also take a rent? And that's not necessarily the case. And that gives rise to this January 2017 paper by Scott Lilienfeld, who wrote a review of the literature on microaggressions, and basically said that, we're only 10 years into this thing. We don't know as much as we think we know, and we should put a moratorium on microaggression training, because we really don't know as much as we think we do. And there's all sorts of problems in the research, and he spelled them out. One of the things he pointed out was something called negative emotionality, that you need to take that into account. Now, take, for instance, me. I'm kind of reserved. I'm introverted. I can be grouchy, right? So if I'm at work and people are getting really loud, I get annoyed, So that might just be, am I being microaggressed, or am I just a grouch? You need to be able to tease that stuff out, Now, that's not to be dismissive of the fact that people are victims of insensitivities. And Lilienfeld himself says that. Of course, we all know that there are racial insensitivities and all sorts of other insensitivities. But we cannot simply take one paper based on this little anecdote that's just 10 years old and then start just charging ahead as if we know all about microaggressions and what in the heck they are. So listening is not sufficient. Intent and effect both need to be taken into account. And then we get into the nature of her understanding of racism. For her, the very fact of systemic inequities, disparities, is itself racism. I argue that's a redefinition of racism, and that goes back to the reifying of whiteness. But my understanding of racism, and I believe this is the historical traditional understanding, is that it's typological reductionism. It's essentially essentializing a population, in this case, say, African Americans in the 19th century, and saying that they all sort of, by all being, having dark skin color, that they all share in some essential trait that distinguishes them from white. So it's typological thinking. That's racism. That's what racism has always been known. And so in arguing that racism is this sort of systemic structural inequity is ultimately to confuse racism itself with the legacy of racism. I am certainly not arguing that there is a legacy of racism. And this systemic or that there is not a legacy of racism. Systemic disparities exist. They are here, and we've got to deal with them. And they are a legacy of racism. And we need to come to terms with that, and there shouldn't be any doubt about that, right? But that's not racism. That's the legacy of racism. Okay. And so by trying to redefine it as systemic inequity itself, that's where you get into this reification of whiteness. And I pause a little.
Well, and ultimately, go ahead. That way of thinking doesn't actually lead to solutions other than listen and obey, or I guess tithing. The only solution then is just a blunt force reparation, where you just deposit 70% of your income into all of the historically marginalized groups.
There's all sorts of. By the way, I've worked in damages analysis when I was in the private sector. All sorts of problems that come up in trying to come up with a valuation, and it's very, very complex.
Yeah.
Trying to quantify it. It's very, very complex. But
one sustained theme in everything that you wrote about, or that you were saying, is that there's this reduction of complexity, which is a bad practice. It's a poor intellectual habit to get into, to reduce complexity. But they're trying to justify the reduction of complexity in order to reduce complexity in a certain way. And so what is the end goal that Robin DiAngelo, so far as you've been able to garner, what is her end goal of
I really don't know,
stuff?
actually. I was going to that's what I was going to raise that question, because, so there's a couple, she says quite often that, anti-racist work is never ending. It's constant, and it never ends. So there's that. But the focus really seems to be on essentially, inclusiveness, diversity, and so on, which, of course, in principle is all fine. I mean, who has a problem with that, right? But the issue is that the way that you do that is by taking down dominance, by taking out.
But the only way that they can take down dominance is by asserting their dominance in the most fragile fashion imaginable.
Yeah.
So they're just reasserting another dominant structure.
So I mean, that the end goal? I don't know. But this will take me. You were sort of directing me into the fourth critique, and I'll get through, which is implicit bias. This is crucial. This is probably the crucial premise about this. Is why she can say that systemic inequities and disparities are in fact evidence of racism, and why in fact we need to why we need to acknowledge fragility, and why we need to listen, and why we need to consider impact, and so on, right? Listening is sufficient. Impact is what is important. Racism is systemic. All of this is because of implicit bias. And the problem is not that I'm not saying that implicit bias is not a thing. I'm not saying that implicit bias is not real. But what I am saying, and I'm pouring through this literature right now. That's my sort of current project. But one thing that's clear when you read it is that the literature is very inconclusive about what implicit bias actually is and how it leads to systemic outcomes. Now, there are papers that say, look, implicit bias is absolutely a thing. And in fact, in some sense they're right, but you have to understand what they mean by that. And, we don't want to get into all the complexity. We'll be here for hours. But the problem is there are also lots of studies that have uncovered problems with the implicit association test. Moreover, and I've been corresponding with a psychologist on this, the retest correlation is very low relative to other things. So in other words, you take a test, you find some kind of result, but another test finds a slightly different result, but the correlation, I think he says that he typically sees like a 0.4 correlation, which is very low to say 0.7 or 0.8. But ultimately the point is that, and this just kind of goes more generally to the so-called replication crisis in psychology. It's very hard to draw general inferences, objective inferences from subjective, what are ultimately what we're talking about are introspective phenomena, which is what's going on in our minds. So basically, and this sort of came up when we were talking about microaggressions, which is sort of a kind of implicit bias. But the basic point is we really don't know as much about implicit bias as we think we do. And that's really the crucial point. If you start reading this literature, it's very inconclusive. So that takes me, that relates to the whole idea of socialization. She thinks she knows exactly how socialization works, but I argue that she doesn't. I argue that a lot of us really don't. It's far more complex, and in part because she assumes that it relies ultimately on implicit bias, but we don't really have as good an understanding of implicit bias as she says. Now, this takes us to one of the most crucial, but also basic problems, is that she constantly says there's no such thing as an objective, neutral reality. The first question that should occur to anybody is that an objective statement in itself? Yes. And if so, then what the hell? We've got a basic inconsistency and a demonstration of really incompetence with logical reasoning. And by the way, that reminds me, I should bring up that when we were talking about Ruth Frankenberg earlier, and I'm going to bring up the quote because she quotes it over and over and over. I'll get it. Don't worry. Just bear with me. It's right here. Let's see. I'll find it. Yep. So, Whiteness Studies begins with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms, and rather than work to prove its existence, works to reveal it. Now, in other words, it assumes the conclusion in advance and simply goes about trying to reveal it. That is circular reasoning. So that brings us back to this point. Doesn't seem to have a very good facility with logical reasoning.
One moment. Yep. Point 4 was implicit bias?
Yes.
It doesn't. Okay, so basically what she's trying to assert is an explicit bias in point 5, right? Like this is an explicit bias that.
Are you talking about objectivity and neutrality?
Well, the whole objectivity thing is that I'm projecting my bias onto reality.
Yeah, I guess you could think of it like that. Yeah, I guess that.
But at least she's being honest and just saying that she's explicitly biased to her conclusions from the get-go.
Well, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. So I thought you were talking about white people, like when she talks about, because for her, objectivity and individuality are ideologies, and that's sort of a form of implicit bias. And what you're saying is she's sort of fessing up to an explicit bias. Well, I don't think that she would say it's a bias. She would say that's just fact. That's reality.
Well, if she said that there's no such thing as objectivity, there's no such thing as reality. Therefore, there's only bias. Therefore, her bias is explicit. A lot of it is preemptive defensiveness and that's the whole thing. Like she's beating you to the punch with defensiveness by already assuming that you're going to be defensive. She's already beating you to the punch with objectivity or argument by already trying to undermine objectivity. But the question remains is that why do people adhere to this if it makes no sense whatsoever? If you actually look at it, it makes no sense, but it's constructed in such a way that the yarn holds to a globe. We're not talking about a completely flat earth, but there's this irreality that's holding itself together and that is bringing adherence to itself. So ultimately, it's a psychological solution because the logical pointing out all these fallacies is only going to evoke more of the psychological phenomena that reinforce this behavior.
I mean, I don't have anything really to add to that. I guess I'm just trying to engage this on the merits, and
I appreciate that. I'm just trying to say that ultimately it's not its power in the world is not based on the merits, and she says explicitly she's bearing that there's no merits to this and that there's no way to evaluate it by its merits, but it has an adherence to it.
Yeah. By the way, that makes me think of Toby Young, who's one of the editors at Quillette. His father
Okay.
is actually the person who came up with the term meritocracy, and he's actually
Oh,
was made. Yeah, it was actually it
that's
was
kind of
meant as a.
nepotistic.
Yeah, well, it was actually apparently in his book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which is a good, funny book, by the way, and I recommend it. But
I practice
um,
this all the time on social media.
yeah, it apparently it was meant as a term of damnation. It was, he was more of an egalitarian, and so that what the problem with meritocracy is, it would give the sort of the rich or the aristocrats or whatever, it would remove their guilt because it would make them feel like they had earned their riches and that sort of thing. So he had a problem with that. But anyway, with respect to the fragility stuff, DiAngelo is likely to say that meritocracy is sort of a shibboleth of some sort because, because of these sort of structural factors that affect, outcomes. So I guess, listening is not sufficient. Intent and impact both need to be taken into account. Racism is typological reductionism. I would argue is that by arguing that simply systemic disparities, it redefines racism, it confuses racism with the legacy. And by the way, I don't want to keep doing these tangents. Implicit bias, confusing objectivity and neutrality, methodologically. Much of what she says is assertion, and in some sense is very speculative because it's based on qualitative distillations of her anecdotal experience, being in focus groups and classrooms and whatever. There's I have read her, there's no sense of her and herself having undertaking rigorous hypothesis testing. She cites to a fair amount of work, but she herself has never rigorously tested a hypothesis.
So it seems like, sorry to interrupt, it seems like
Yep.
her qualia, which is based on anecdote, resonates with other people's qualia. It's basically a sophistic rhetorical maneuver to invoke certain feelings within the audience, which empowers people of a certain ethnic or racial disposition and disempowers people in a very empowering way. I guess that's what she's offering. Disempowerment in the most empowering way. Like that whole race to dinner thing where you can have these black women come to your dinner party and sell you Tupperware dildos and white guilt, right? There's this whole contingent that loves this. And unfortunately, this contingent that loves this is in positions of power because they're all a bunch of bureaucrats.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that particular thing that you mentioned, but there's a complete absence of rigorous hypothesis testing, no falsification, and that sort of thing. So, it's not rigorous is really the main point, and so that brings us to this idea that what she's ultimately offering are doctrines, they're theories, not theory as something that can be tested, but theory as a kind of a way of looking at a narrative. It's a sort of a mental scheme of bias, or that's how she understands theory. She says we have these internal maps that we use to navigate the world. But as I've written time and again, I think she has a real misunderstanding of what theory is and so on. But those are pretty much. And then of course there's the genetic fallacy, which is. Which kind of brings us back to square one in a sense by saying that by subjecting this to any kind of scrutiny, just having a question that you're fragile. But the real point here is identity politics, which is that viewpoint diversity is the same thing as sort of group diversity, and that what I have often heard. So, for instance, I have argued to somebody that I know, a relative, that she's writing about critical theory in her book on social justice about Horkheimer and Adorno and so on, and that they had the skepticism of the scientific method and so on, which they didn't, by the way. But that the point is that what she was saying is that what they questioned is whose rationality and whose objectivity. That's what they were critiquing.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's not what they were critiquing. That is not what Adorno and Horkheimer were critiquing. What they were critiquing was the instrumentalization. I have a slight speech apraxia still lingering from the surgery. That reason had been instrumentalized by the scientific apparatus of capitalistic society. I can flesh that out and so on. But anyway, my basic point is that she misconstrues the fundamental thing that she's trying to say. So I'm making this point to somebody who's very much in sort of the social justice mind. The basic response is, that's according to you. So the issue is, you're not evaluating what I'm saying on the merits. You're invalidating by the fact that, on the basis of the fact that I said it, and this gives rise to a basic distinction between truth and perspective. So you're saying I have a perspective on this matter, and you're saying that what I'm positing a claim that I take to be true, and you're saying that it's only my truth, but it's not. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. What I want to illustrate is the genetic fallacy. And the point is that my claim that she misconstrues a basic claim of the critical theorists is being evaluated in the following sense. That's according to you. That is, the merit of the claim depends on the fact that I'm saying it, not on the logical grounds, the factual grounds. It's the fact that I'm saying it. That's what's called the genetic fallacy.
No, it's called like the playground fallacy. That's what a 4-year-old says. Jeez.
I mean, I suppose so. Yes, but you could. The funny thing about this is that you could actually, we've talked for an hour or so, or almost an hour. I don't know, but you can basically throw this all back at DiAngelo by saying this is just all according to you. Why should I take it seriously? Just you. It's just your truth. Which
goes back to that she is pleasing people to very steep monetary gain for herself. She's pleasing people who have...
Is it really? I had wondered about that. I mean, I wonder if she probably sells a lot of books.
No, she sells a lot of books. Her speaking fees are in the tens of thousands. I don't have the exact number, but they are in the tens of thousands. Unless she's...
Well, you brought this question about as to why it resonates so much, and I don't really have a good... I mean, I don't want to really get in... I mean, the best I can think of...
But we can answer this insofar as it disresonates with you. What about it irks you? Like, let's get into just the pure qualia, your biography, your anecdotal experience. Why do you dislike this on an aesthetic or a personal level?
I just think it's a very weak theory. I don't think it explains very much. I think it's based on misunderstandings of a lot of concepts. Okay. I don't think it's very rigorous. I think it's almost intellectually dishonest, and that's the whole fragility trap thing. But ultimately, I just think it's very weak because it's not rigorous. She asserts, she doesn't argue. And I mean, just go through the implicit bias literature. Sure, implicit bias is a thing that we need to think about, that we need to study, that we need to understand. But as far as I can tell, psychologists don't have any consensus understanding of this.
Yeah. Okay.
Microaggressions. I mean, we're talking about something that's 10 years old. I mean, it's like this thing is embryonic, and all of a sudden it's just got this cultural currency. So I just think it does not hold up as a matter under scrutiny. Okay. And I guess if you want to say why it irked me, I mean, I try not to get really emotional about it, but I will say that...
Well, don't be... Okay, let's just suspend your stoicism for just one moment.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, what got me started on this was I was talking to a relative of mine who's really steeped in this kind of stuff, and I remember just sending an article I'd written for Good Muddin Project, I think, and just about that the confirmation bias might be a problem in some of the stuff that goes on in social justice activism. And then maybe something else I sent. And the only response I was getting was, why are you so fragile? Why are you so fragile? Why are you so fragile? And at first I was like, well, because I think this is not a good line of reasoning. I think that there's some cognitive errors going on. And all I kept going was, why so fragile? And so I just realized there's something really wrong with that. And that's when I started looking into this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I guess it's a bigger problem to figure out. We can, I guess I'm trying to make this talk and your work do more than it can possibly do. Your work shores up a very solid argument so that people can work through this and purge it, or kind of locate why they think it's weak. Because you're doing all the work to just show rigorously why it's weak. Right? But there's more work to be done to ask why people are attracted to the weakness of this argument.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. And grievance studies, I think that they probably tapped into some insight on that.
Are you talking about Lindsay, Pluckrose, and Boghossian?
Yeah, just the idea that that it's fueled by, in some sense, a kind of what did Nietzsche call it? Ressentiment or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. But I mean, it's unlike DiAngelo. I'll be the first to admit that I'm purely speculating at this point. It's something I really have to think through.
Yeah.
But if I had to take a guess at the moment, I would say that the grievance studies stuff really tapped into something that's that helps to explain why it resonates so much. Okay. Because you look at Mike Nana's videos, right? Or you look at what from Evergreen. Go back to reification. Look what Shakespeare showed us in Coriolanus, basically mob rule. When the mob sort of takes over, it's you're suspending your facility to think through this independently, to do your thinking for yourself, and you sort of I'm pausing for a reason here. The reason is I really want to make this point clear. I'm thinking of people that I know, I say people plural because I'm not thinking of only one person, going back to high school. And I'm thinking, these are people who I never thought of as, people who are like willing to do the hard work logically, to really do the research, but would be very susceptible to sort of catching on to a bandwagon, if you will. And it's not to say that they don't sincerely believe in the cause, but become very susceptible to becoming part of that cause under the name of something like justice, right? The whole idea is social justice. Who could be against social justice, right? And then, okay. So I'm sorry, I was a little tangential there, but this brings me back to an argument that I've been working through in my head. So I think there's a history to this.
Okay. And
part of it has to do with the whole postmodernism, and you hear Lindsay on Twitter, talking about applied postmodernism, and so there's an intellectual history to this, right? The idea of postmodernism, and I'm speaking loosely, obviously. Again, in keeping with the sort of integrity of intellectual inquiry, we ultimately want to parse through all the nuances here. But the idea is a discourse, power, dominance narratives, and all that. come out of the work of like Foucault and Derrida and whatever. And actually, it's more complicated. There's like 4 ways to read Foucault and whatever. But the idea of dominance narratives has a history. Now, similarly, in the 60s, you have lots of activism, and they were trying to change society in all sorts of ways. The 60s and 70s was all about activism, and then I would argue that sometime in the 80s, you had a backlash. Reagan comes into office, and so on. Yeah. Meanwhile, a lot of activists were sort of going into the universities, and they were sort of following this sort of Antonio Gramsci script. And Gramsci is a so-called neo-Marxist who talked about so-called war of position, that what you ultimately need to do is you need to take over, assume control of the sort of institutions so that you can then become the progenitor of norms and so on. And so essentially, I mean, I feel a little grubby saying this, but sort of like a takeover of the universities, if you will. But it's not so conspiratorial as that. It's more of like a movement that kind of stems from the 60s, and even before that, if you really want to go through it. But with the end of the Cold War, you no longer have this sort of unifying force of like anti-Soviet or just a Cold War, whatever. Okay. Meanwhile, there was sort of a lot of the rise of sort of leftist liberal trends in the university, and then you have books written by like Harold Bloom and Schlesinger, and basically expressing concerns about the rise of political correctness and identity politics. And then you have sort of a growing divide between the right and left, which begins with like Rush Limbaugh and Bill Clinton and so on. And then, for a while, this was all channeled through the Iraq War and so on. But basically a polarization. Now, I hesitate to talk more about this because I'm thinking about this. A lot of other people are thinking about this, and a lot of people have very different.
Well, let's restrain it to what you were speaking about people who were susceptible to bandwagoning.
Yeah. So
you have a lot of people not unified, so disunified.
So what I'm saying is there's a history to this, and it's all led us to where we are now. Yeah. Now, in terms of delineating all the nuances, we'll put that aside. But what it has led to is a kind of what we know as the sort of social justice movement. Right? Now, what is that movement? Again, we'll put that aside and I acknowledge it is all very complex. But we've arrived at a point where the narrative now, the discussion, the conversation revolves around a kind of understanding of racism as a phenomenon of systemic disparities, and that those systemic disparities we all can acknowledge. They are all, just look at the data, clear as can be. But we have also sort of arrived at this sort of understanding of how those things are sustained. And it has to do with this sort of reification of whiteness. The idea is that it's no longer about sort of widening the circle of inclusion. It's about decentering whiteness. That brings us back to this reification thing. Decentering whiteness, the so-called centripetal ideology or discourse of whiteness, it only makes sense if there is, in fact, something called whiteness that lies at the center of our society and lies at the center of what we are supposed to understand as a white supremacist society.
Well, but those things are just code words. Whiteness, white supremacy is now just a code word for something else. Western,
well,
maybe.
There's your reification fallacy. That's your reification fallacy. So whiteness is supposed to be an ideology, a discourse, or whatever that centers everything into its own center, and it's manifested through these relationships of dominance. Yeah. But of course, what you're saying very reasonably, I think at least, is that whiteness is just a code word. It's an abstraction. And the fallacy lies in the sort of belief that it's infused, embodied in us, in books, in institutions, real things.
And we need to root it out. That's the only acceptable
fallacy
solution.
Or the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This idea. Now, I mean, look, one thing that we haven't really gotten into, and we don't have to, but DiAngelo really wants us to start with the idea that we have a so-called white racial frame, that we have been socialized with a racial frame, and we just don't know it, because part of our socialization is that we've been socialized to not know it, and so on and so forth. And you could unpack that in a lot of different ways. I've tried to do that in my own mind, but really what the point here is to ultimately see this notion of whiteness as something that underlies at the core of our society, underlies systemic disparities. And my basic concern, my concern in all this is that I just don't think that that's very, I mean, first of all, it's based on a logical fallacy, but also I just don't think that it's really clearly worked out.
Well, okay, and because it's not clearly worked out, it won't work out to anything clear. Like, the result is not clear, right?
I mean, I'm still gonna, look, I am still open-minded about this, and my study is ongoing, and I'm going through the literature. I've read plenty of papers. I mean, I think that there's a lot of very interesting claims. I've read people like Lawrence Blum, John Powell, Ruth Frankenberg, and a bunch of other papers. And so, this is an ongoing thing for me. I mean, I guess you could say in that sense I'm following DiAngelo's advice to be open-minded about this, right? Yeah. The problem is that I arrive at different conclusions as she does, or at least different questions. And if I do that, then suddenly I'm no longer, or I'm suddenly falling, I'm so suddenly fragile, like, like for instance, look, Coleman Hughes, right? He makes a really good argument about the so-called systemic disparity, is that the problem is that they apply it narrowly and not broadly, so that when disparities work one way, which is, look, white people are more wealthy, they make more income, they're at the top of Silicon Valley, and so on and so forth, right? We all know that. So you have a systemic disparity. But then when it works the other way, they never invoke racism. So, for instance, he cites this study in the New York Times talking about another study, I guess, where I'll bring it up. Hold on. But basically, the point was that what it ultimately showed was that conditional on parental income, black women either
they're above.
They're doing really well. Had greater. I'll find it. Here it is. Higher college attendance rates than white men, and higher incomes than white women, conditional on parental income. So there's a systemic disparity that runs the other way. And I mean, I can imagine what the response from DiAngelo or others would be, but as a purely logical matter, you're essentially it's just not holding up. By the way, economist Raj Cherry, who's very big on inequality, talks about effects of neighborhoods and how poor neighborhoods have a bigger effect on boys and girls. So that's another example. But anyway, so that's all. So I really think the reification fallacy is really central to understand. And I might not have. I mean, the basic idea is what I said it is, but working it out in terms of examples, I mean, that's something I'm still.
Well, okay, the thing is that at least you're working things out. At least we're working things out. We might be completely wrong and fragile, but at least we're engaging with the material. I mean, maybe that's the only thing that we have to stand on, that we don't need to claim authority, but we do claim interaction. At least we're working it out for ourselves. We're not learning. We are engaging in a conversation or a dialogue with this material. I guess that's all we can really put ourselves on at this point.
Yeah. I mean, that's all I ultimately ask for. But, I'm not confident. I guess when you asked why does this resonate one of the things that I was talking about earlier that Angelo says is the way that she sort of uses language in all this, so that if you are quote unquote defensive, you're essentially engaging in white racial bullying and that sort of thing. And I can understand why she says that, but I also say that she says that because she's so indoctrinated in her own doctrines that she's sort of made up a whole new language for herself. But that kind of language really resonates. If you try to talk about this in terms of, well, there is a distinction between objectivity and neutrality, and that objectivity is about rigorous evaluation and hypothesis testing and falsification and so on. And nobody's really saying that that's the same thing as neutrality and blah, blah, blah. Talk about Popper and talk about implicit bias and all that. People don't want to hear that. When you talk about, well, you've just got, I am white and I am a racist and I need to understand what you are telling, that resonates. So it's almost in some sense a linguistic thing.
Well, thanks a lot, Jonathan. You really poured your knowledge into my head. I do want to have you back on to talk about economics because that's your actual originating thing. But maybe you've moved on into the realms of implicitness and fragility.
I'm still. I just got into this because I mean, really, just intellectual curiosity, but also I really thought that it was just bad thinking. I mean, and if it were just bad thinking, I mean, you just kind of do away with it. But it's had such a huge influence. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I am, economics is where I'm trained, and I write a few articles on economics here and there. So
I really appreciate the work you're doing, and thanks a lot for coming on. This has been fun.
Sorry it went over a little bit, but I appreciate being on, and I probably tried to dominate a little bit, but it was just a lot I wanted to say.
You know what? You proved you're whiter than I am, just purely by word count in this this conversation. That really makes it fit. All
right. Well, sorry, I won't take up any of your time. Thanks a lot, Benjamin.
All right, Jonathan. You have a good night.
Okay, you too.
All right, ciao.